Again, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Rachel Johnston, and I am the BWC TTA Program Manager at CNA. Our next session is BWC 101, Past, Present, and Future with John Markovic and Mike White.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, this session is called Body-Worn Cameras 101, the Past, Present, and Future. I'm John Markovic again. If you joined late or just joining the session, I'm the BWC Program Manager Lead and a Senior Policy Advisor with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and Dr. Mike White, who is our co-director of the BWC TTA, working closely with CNA. Mike's from ASU, Arizona State University. He'll be up after me. So, okay, there we go. All right, this is my contact information. Chief Acevedo was so kind to oblige with his personal, which is direct email. We like to do the same. If you have questions, particularly about the policy side of our program, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll just leave it at that. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, Kristen, I think, alluded to some of these in her introductory remarks. The body-worn camera program is nested within the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and just to give you an idea, BJA is the largest grant-making agency in the Department of Justice under the umbrella of the Office of Justice Programs. We support state, local, and tribal justice strategies through our funding. We help develop policy, promote best practices. Our mission statement stresses our work with crime reduction and strengthening communities. And would also add to that, improving justice outcomes. So body-worn cameras, I think, the body-worn camera program, I think, is exemplary of the efforts we do. Obviously, we do a lot more. There are a lot of funding opportunities, and I invite you to visit our website, to follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep apprised of what we're doing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with us, but some of you may not be as familiar. So retrospectively, we started this program in 2015 at a time when there was a national call for accountability, transparency, and I think achieving procedural justice. There were several officer-involved shooting incidents that I think set the mood. Mike is going to drill down on that a little bit more. And there was the formation of the President's Commission on 21st Century Policing, which was a springboard for this program and for the accountability and transparency and civility that body-worn cameras had the promise of bringing. The particular thing about the body-worn camera program is that it's not just an equipment purchase program. It's a fully, it's a broad, holistic program that's meant to be deliberate, comprehensive, and developed with broad stakeholder input. Kristen alluded to the fact in her opening remarks, what works in one city or state may not work in another city or state, and that's becoming more evident as we move along, as cities and states, particularly states, are weighing in with legislation. And consistent with most of our programs, we believe that the body-worn program should be data-driven, evidence-based, and evolving as the field evolves, as the technology evolves. So as you all probably know, if you're a grantee, this is a competitive grant solicitation for body-worn camera program development. It supports fundamentally the purchase or leases of body-worn cameras as well as the related equipment. As I said, it's not merely a purchase program. One of the key elements is that it requires an establishment of a comprehensive body-worn camera policy that's developed in a very deliberate way and with stakeholder input. And when we say stakeholder input, that's internal stakeholders, union representatives, if you have them, the rank and file, but also clearly it's important to consult with the prosecutors who will be using the data. A lot of agencies reach out more broadly to their community groups and major institutions within their community, maybe a hospital or a university where officers are often deployed. So when you applied, you were chosen on the basis of a commitment to broad program elements. Internal and external partnerships are part of that. a commitment to body-worn camera training, not just how to turn on the cameras, but how to best use them, training to policy, and then embedding, hopefully, body-worn camera footage from your own agency into your training. We'll talk about that in some of our sessions today. It became increasingly evident that body-worn cameras are more than just a tool for transparency and accountability. They also have a lot of evidentiary value, particularly when used correctly. So the field is evolving in that area, and we have some discussions in and around that today. And then I think one of the things we're doing, and Chief Acevedo alluded to the massive amounts of data that are coming from body-worn cameras and dashboard cameras and other cameras, such as still cameras. We're just helping agencies sort of understand how they deal with that tsunami of digital evidence media and how they can best leverage it. We're working with about 7 of our grantees on a project related to that, both the law enforcement executives, law enforcement agencies, as well as some prosecutors' offices. So, as you know, if you're a grantee, we really try to meet you where you're at. The body-worn camera program supports different types of programs. Often, as was the case in Miami that Chief Acevedo spoke to, is, the deployment isn't originally to patrol officers or sworn officers or all officers who have regular contact with the public, but then they're often expanded to include other officers. So in Miami, they expanded to the SWAT team. We had a large grant with LAPD to supplement their already existing program early on in the BWC program. And then Los Angeles came and wanted to expand their program to include cameras for their transit police. So we funded them in the expansion of that program. So we allow you to, if you had one bite of the apple, to come back and expand your program with our funding. So I just wanted to give you a really brief overview of this is where the sites were in the inaugural year of our award. There is on the BWC TTA website, if you go to sites, I believe, in the menu, you'll be able to get to an interactive map where you can zoom in on your locality, see who else around you has body-worn cameras, what year they've got the cameras. And I think that can begin some of the regional collaboration that Chief Acevedo alluded to. I think that's becoming increasingly important, not only to help you purchase, but to help you manage the data both. So we call that, or I call it, vertical and horizontal integration. So vertical with other agencies in and around you, particularly those in your county that share a DA, and then vertically with the prosecutor's offices and with the courts and with the defense attorneys, optimally sharing that data for efficiency. I get a little carried away with maps. I'm sort of a mapping person. On that last slide, it just showed basically the cumulative funding to date and how we're arrayed across the country. So I think we've hit pretty much every state. The little feed that you had as we were waiting to start the meeting, the state-by-state comparisons provided counts by states. We've had more grantees from some states than others. And again, you can look at the map on the BWC TTA website. So every year we've allocated somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million for body-worn cameras. You can see that to date, through 2020, we'll support over 81,000 cameras in the field and provided approximately just under $100 million for funding to 460 grants. Next slide, please. Well, I think before I go, Kristen alluded to this. So the reason why we've had a drop in funding in 2020 is that we allocated half our funding to be a set aside for small, rural, and tribal law enforcement agencies. One of the challenges that small, rural, and tribal agencies have is they are not as competitive in the grant process. They don't have grant administrators. They don't have the resources. And should they be awarded, it's sometimes a heavy lift for the executives, if they're not blessed with having administrative staff, and particularly a grant administrator, sometimes the executives themselves have to manage the grants, which is a tall order. So in 2020, we are running a separate micro grant program that should be announced probably somewhere around June 28th of this year, of this month, in June. And we are running that simultaneously with the general body-worn camera program. So this is just my penchant for mapping. I think that shows basically the footprint. The larger the dot, the more agents, the more cameras, or the larger the funding was for those agencies. And roughly speaking, the amount of funding relates strongly to the number of cameras we supported in those jurisdictions. The next, and here you can see I broadened out, we've hit Alaska, Hawaii, and we have quite a few grants in Puerto Rico, and also have had a grant for the Virgin Islands. So it just gives you an idea of the geographic spread. And that's the geographic spread for the 40 agencies that received 2020 BWC funding. As you can see, we've had a variety of different types of agencies receive awards. By and large, the largest category is municipal police departments, followed by sheriffs. But we've also expanded to correctional agencies. We've had 9 correctional agencies who are now using body-worn cameras. They're eligible for funding, provided they perform law enforcement functions. So that applies to most state correctional agencies. And we're just really learning a lot from them in working with them, how policies differ, how some of the use case scenarios for cameras differ. And then we've also got, as you can see, a lot of different special communities, including tribal law enforcement agencies, school agencies. One of our categories that we like most is the consortia of agencies. We've had the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency apply on behalf of dozens of departments, so they're sub-grantees. So we get sort of a bigger bang for the buck. It helps those small agencies, much like our small rural and tribal agency is designed to do, is they're sub-recipients. In the case of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, they manage the grants. They're responsible for the reporting. So the body-worn cameras, the law enforcement agencies that are getting body-worn cameras are alleviated from some of that grant management and fiscal reporting responsibility. So you can see that's we've got a lot of different experience, and again, alluding back to Kristen's comments, context matters in terms of states and cities, but also in the types of law enforcement agencies in which these are deployed. And we've done some special webinars and podcasts in and around these topics, like implementing body-worn camera programs in tribal agencies, or in special jurisdiction agencies like school police departments and university police departments. Okay, before I turn it over to Dr. White of ASU, I want to talk a little bit about where we think we're going in the future. During the 7 years of this program, we've certainly learned a lot. There's been a tremendous amount of growth, not just in the number of agencies adopting BWCs, but also in practice. So we've noticed several trends and initiatives. One, I think, is we've evolved to meet the needs of the small tribal and rural agencies, particularly in the solicitation end of things. I think we've always been attentive to their special needs through our podcast, through our webinars, through our outreach with the TTA teams. But I think we're making that road easier for them with the grants beginning this year. We also know that the legal terrain has evolved. Most notably, states and to some extent localities have now developed legislation affecting BWCs. A growing number of states are now mandating BWCs, and many are having directives that are legislated in things like the minimum time that body-worn camera footage has to be retained, or state dictates about the release of videos to the public, request to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, things like that. And as Chief Acevedo alluded to, federal agencies are evolving in their use of body-worn cameras. The special task force that was set up to deal with the issue, the special study group that was meant to deal with the issue of task force deployment, where local officers were on federal task forces, be it with the DEA or the FBI. There was a little bit of a rub there where the feds said that the locals couldn't wear body-worn cameras during those deployments, and a lot of the locals had issues with that, particularly when they were, in essence, potentially violating state law that required them to use body-worn cameras. So DOJ has moved forward on that, and now there's been an edict in early June that federal law enforcement officers will now be using body-worn cameras. Initially, the legislation called for that for uniformed federal officers, but now they'll be looks like they'll be wearing body-worn cameras across the board when doing things like executing warrants. All that's currently under development. The federal law enforcement agencies are now developing, under the directives of the federal government, developing policies. We're learning more about how BWCs can be used for training. I mentioned earlier that we hope that you won't be just training your officers on how to use the cameras and training them how to use them in compliance with policy, but hopefully you'll be integrating body-worn camera footage into your training regimen, showing sort of good practice through de-escalation techniques that were particularly successful, and so forth and so on. And then I think looking into the future, as more agencies have cameras, I think we want to support additional purpose areas. So we sometimes get questions from grantees about the ability to use grants for things other than using cameras. The agency may say, we already have our cameras, but we're looking to develop our compliance mechanism, or we're looking to prevent our management of digital media evidence. Right now, the way that the legislative language is written, the body-worn camera program is predicated on the purchase of cameras. So we can't distribute funds for this program unless the agency is proposing to purchase or lease cameras. So we're hoping in the next fiscal year, FY 2022, they will open it up to purpose areas where we can support agencies that are looking to refine their programs, but not necessarily get additional cameras or initiate cameras. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. White, who will give us a bit of a broader perspective of the environment, of the research, and a little bit about the future of body-worn cameras from his perspective. Thanks.
All right, thanks, John. As John said, my name is Mike White. I'm a professor at Arizona State University and co-director of the TTA team. ASU's had the pleasure and honor of working with BJA, CNA, and JSS since the very beginning of this program. So what I wanted to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to continue with the framework that John laid out, the past, present, and future. And I think there's value in looking back, because looking back helps us to understand where we are now, and it also gives us some insights on where we're going to be moving into the future. So let's start by talking about the past, if you will. So if we think about the past, there was kind of a slow burning interest in body-worn cameras before 2014, and a couple examples are illustrated on this slide. So on the left, you see a report that was issued by PERF and the COPS office. PERF actually held a one-day conference on body-worn cameras in late 2013, and the product of that conference was the report you see on the left. PERF also did a survey of their membership back in 2013, asking about the technology, and about a third of the agencies that responded, so about 30% or so, said they had deployed at least some cameras. Also, on the right is a report that I wrote back in 2013 for the Department of Justice. I was asked to write a report that kind of laid out all the issues at the time and review the very limited amount of research that was available. So, so there was some interest there before the summer of 2014. But as John had indicated, in the summer of 2014, there were a series of officer-involved shootings of citizens that led to public outrage, civil disorder, and riots in some cities, and led to a strong push for reform and for police accountability. And you know, I think it was that summer really that kind of jump-started the push for body-worn cameras. You know, for example, in November of 2014, it was right after the grand jury decision not to indict the officer who shot Michael Brown. Well, the day after that, that decision not to indict, Michael Brown's mother issued a call that was publicized nationally for all police officers to have body-worn cameras. So Michael Brown's mother issues that call in late November, and then less than 2 weeks later, President Obama gives a speech at the White House addressing and laying out a plan to deal with this emerging crisis in police community relations. And during that speech, he does a couple of important things. He outlines a plan to strengthen community policing. It was also at this speech where he announced the formation of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And I think most importantly for our purposes, the President also issued a pledge for federal money, up to $75 million for the purchase of 50,000 body-worn cameras nationally. So the federal government, the White House, Department of Justice moves very quickly in response to that emerging crisis, and the President issues that call, and then it's on BJA to take action. And the BJA did a couple of important things immediately. And the first was that they held an expert panel at the White House. Director Mahoney mentioned this in her opening remarks. And I had the honor of facilitating this panel with a colleague of mine, Charles Katz at ASU. And, you know, essentially what BJA did is they invited over 100 really smart people within law enforcement, outside of law enforcement, prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and you know, they locked us in a room for 2 days, and we had essentially a giant brainstorming session about this technology. And the information that was culled from that 2-day expert panel did a couple of things. One is it served as the foundation for the National Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, which you see here, and you see the link here. The toolkit went live a few months after the expert panel. It's an information warehouse. It's a website. I urge you to take a look. It has everything we need to know or currently know about this technology. And it doesn't matter if you're a chief of police, a line officer, a concerned citizen, or a civil rights attorney. It's a great place to go if you want to learn about this technology. So the other thing that BJA did is they had to build the program that originated from President Obama's pledge for funding, that $75 million for 50,000 body-worn cameras. And John just talked about the evolution of that program over time. And here we are 6 years in. We far exceeded that initial pledge. BJA, as you saw from the figures John just showed you, 450 plus grants, approaching $100 million, over 81,000 body-worn cameras. So the program really has come a long way. And the other thing, you may be wondering, why is this guy from ASU talking? Who are these CNA people? Who's JSS? The other thing that BJA did is they created what's called a training and technical assistance team. And that's who we are. CNA, Arizona State, and Justice and Security Strategies. Our sole job really is to make sure that you're successful with your grant funding. And we do a wide variety of things to make sure you have everything you need to be successful. Some of these things, of course, had to be modified over the last year or so because of COVID, but a like I said, our job is to provide resources to use that you can be successful. We'll talk in the afternoon about the administrative policy review, and we heard from John about that already. Webinars and podcasts. We have connected sites. Pre-COVID, we've had representatives from one site visit another site to discuss topics like auditing and compliance or training. So our job, like I said, is to help you get to where you need to be with this technology. Okay, so that was the past. That was kind of flying through the last 6 years, both generally in terms of body-worn cameras, but then also specifically with this program. Let's talk about the present. There are two things I want to highlight in the present. The first is the research. What does the evidence tell us about body-worn cameras? And then the second I'll mention is policy. When BJA got started with this program, there was very little research on body-worn cameras and the impact they might have. Back in 2015, if you remember that report that I had mentioned that I wrote, there were only 5 studies that had been done, and a couple of them weren't very good. Several were from overseas. But flash forward to 2021, there are now more than 100 studies that have been conducted. So just as the cameras themselves have diffused quickly and widespread throughout the United States, as we saw from John's map, we researchers have been pretty good in terms of catching up as well, in terms of, with regard to the research that we've conducted. At times it can be hard to keep up. At times it can be frustrating. You'll have one study come out with a set of findings that is contradictory or the exact opposite of other research studies. So what I thought I'd do is just for a few minutes kind of highlight the major themes that we've seen in research, and again give you some insights on what the current state of knowledge is. So the 100+ studies that have been conducted have focused on a wide range of outcomes, and I just hit a couple of these. One area of focus has been police officers themselves. So what do police officers think of wearing cameras? There have been more than 30 studies that have looked at that. And those studies, generally speaking, find that officers have positive attitudes about cameras, especially after deployment. I think the best studies in this area ask officers about cameras both before and after they're wearing them. And we've seen that the attitudes of police officers are generally pretty positive after they start wearing the cameras. There are some areas where officers are negative in terms of their views or skeptical. One example, officers generally have been skeptical about the impact of the camera on citizen behavior, that it's going to have a civilizing effect on citizens. But overall, officers have positive attitudes. A series of studies have looked at citizens as well, and those studies have pretty unanimously shown that citizens have positive attitudes about police body-worn cameras. That includes studies that look at just kind of general population, as well as studies that focus very specifically on individuals who have an interaction with a police officer, and that interaction is recorded. The studies of those folks also show positive attitudes. John mentioned procedural justice. A couple of studies have come out within the last year that have looked at the relationship between the deployment of cameras and the impact on procedural justice. And those studies have shown a connection, that citizens view their encounters as more procedurally just when officers are wearing cameras. And the connection there, the important connection is that not only the procedural justice piece, but that can lead to enhanced views of police legitimacy, something that's very important. Studies have also focused on the impact of the cameras on officers themselves, particularly with regard to their activities, such as making arrests, such as issuing citations, such as self-initiated activity. The studies have been a little more mixed here. For example, there are studies that show that arrest activities go down, while other studies have shown that it goes up. I think the most important one here is the proactivity question. There are concerns about the surveillance aspect of the cameras. There are concerns about, given the current climate, that officers might pull back and engage in depolicing if they're required to wear cameras. And there isn't any evidence that that's happened, which is a good thing. One area that hasn't received a lot of attention is the impact of the footage downstream in the criminal justice system. But the few studies that have been done show positive effects in terms of cases are more likely to be prosecuted, and you're more likely to have quicker dispositions and guilty outcomes when you have video and audio from a body-worn camera. That's especially true in domestic violence cases. But this is an area, I think, where we need a little more work. I think the area that garners the most attention in terms of the impact of the cameras is the impact on use of force, the impact on citizen complaints. Some of those early studies that I mentioned showed pretty dramatic drops in use of force and complaints after officers started wearing cameras. One of the earliest studies was in Rialto, California. You can see on the left of the slide the percentage drops here. So after officers in Rialto started wearing cameras, complaints dropped by 88%, use of force dropped by 60%. So really extraordinary changes in those outcomes. And Orlando was another example. So those early studies showed some really positive effects. But as time passed, the evidence got more mixed. Some studies, like the Milwaukee study, showed an impact on one of those outcomes, but not the other. The DC Metro study is probably the most cited example of a study that showed no impact on either of those outcomes. So that's what I meant when I said sometimes it can be frustrating. You see studies with different results. How can that be? One of the things that we've done to try to help kind of keep focus on the overriding themes is we've created outcome directories, and you see the link at the bottom of the slide. And these are user-friendly, we hope user-friendly resources that can very quickly highlight what the prevailing themes are on a given outcome. So for example, we have outcome directories that highlight the results from studies examining the impact on complaints and the impact on use of force. There have been 29 studies that have looked at that question about complaints. 22 of the 29 have shown post-deployment complaints decrease substantially or by a statistically significant amount. That's 75% of studies. That's pretty consistent. A little less consistent with use of force, 13 and 26. But again, I think that's pretty persuasive evidence. So check out those outcome directories if you want to see kind of the themes in the body of evidence to date. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of the present in that past, present, future framework is policy. As John indicated, administrative policy is a centerpiece of this program. And, we believe there's good reasons for that. There is decades and decades of research showing that administrative policy is important as a guide for police officer discretion and decision-making. We've seen that with use of force. We've seen it with canine deployments, with foot and auto pursuits, arrest behavior, you name it. So we've kind of anchored our belief on the importance of policy in that larger body of research. And our philosophy is very, very basic and very simple. We believe that a good body-worn camera policy will lead to good body-worn camera practice. And that's why we've designed a fairly robust policy review process that looks at the 9 issues that you see here. I have a session later today that I'll talk in greater depth with John and Charles Stevenson about the policy review process. But we really think it's an important piece of the puzzle here. All right, so the future. So we've talked about the past, we talked about the present, the future. What's coming down the pike? What are the things that we need to be thinking about? Chief Acevedo, I think, hit on a lot of those issues during his keynote. John mentioned I think that the big overriding theme for us is the local context matters, and it matters in a number of different ways, and it matters in terms of policy and practice. And I think Director Mahoney talked about this in her opening remarks. What works for one jurisdiction and agency might not work for another. So what one agency decides to do with public release of footage may not work for another agency in another state. There are going to be differences in decisions that are made with regard to digital evidence management and storage and internal use, and that's okay, and that's a good thing. And that's why this program is designed with a lot of flexibility in terms of the local context and the decisions that are made locally. It also matters for the research evidence. I think one of the reasons that we see some variation in studies of use of force and other outcomes is that the local context matters. What was the state of the police department when they deployed cameras? Were they in crisis? Were they under consent decree? Or is it a really solid professional department that has all the proper accountability mechanisms in place, and they're just deploying cameras as one more example of that professionalism? The other thing is that not all research studies are the same. Some are better than others, and we need to take that into account. And then the last thing, local context matters, particularly with regard to the federal landscape and some of the things that John mentioned, the George Floyd Act currently being considered by Congress, the decisions about task forces, and also the decision to have federal law enforcement officers. And this decision, that memo came out, less than 2 weeks ago. So local context matters, and you see a kind of a shameless book plug there on each of the last few slides. The book I published last year with Dr. Ali Mom, that we hit hard on that local context issue, and I think that's going to be the most important thing we need to keep in mind as we move forward over the next several years with regard to this technology. So I believe that's all from me, and I'll kick it back to the CNA folks. Rachel.